Roman Colosseum, death became mass entertainment. Amphitheaters demonstrated the power of the emperor. Convicted criminals were sent here to be devoured by wild beasts. In time, those criminals would include Christians. Ever since the time of Caesar Augustus, all religions were tolerated by Rome, provided that their worshippers performed their civic duty and sacrificed to the cult of the emperor. It was this that eventually brought Christians into conflict with Roman authority. But at the end of the 1st century, Christianity was still the religion of a few. The Roman Empire was overwhelmingly pagan, and it seemed impossible to imagine that the teachings of an obscure sect could challenge its influence.
Religion in the ancient world is very much a part of public life. They had no idea of a separation of religion and state.
Paganism is the rich, native, religious stew of a traditional society in the Mediterranean. It's a spiritual universe that's thickly populated with gods and spirits. When you look up into the stars at night, you see the souls of heroes.
Paganism was very tolerant of other religions. The Olympian gods were revered, but this did not prevent their devotees worshiping other gods.
You have low-tech religions like magic. People routinely go to magicians. If you have a sinus infection, if you need somebody to fall in love with you, if you're betting on a horse and you've lost the past 3 races, you go to a professional.
At the same time, more and more people were seeking solace in more spiritual and personal forms of religion. A fresco in Pompeii shows worshippers celebrating the solemn rites of the ancient Dionysian mystery cult. And newer cults, often from foreign parts, were taking hold around the empire.
Greatest of the gods, first of names, thou rulest over the mid-air and the immeasurable space. Thou art the lady of light and flame.
One would have found in the major cities of the Mediterranean basin a cult of the Egyptian gods. Egyptian cults would have included probably Isis as the ascendant deity. Isis was perceived by her devotees as being remarkably attentive. Isis would respond to you when you were in trouble. She would answer your prayers. She had that reputation. One of the most important representations of Isis is what we call the Isis lactans. That's Isis suckling her offspring at her breast. This is a kind of iconography that appears to have been terribly determinative in the early iconography of Mary and Jesus.
Worshippers of the age-old Persian god Mithras gathered in secret chapels throughout the empire. They would eat sacred meals together and celebrate their god's birthday on December 25th.
The Egyptian cult and Mithraism were two of the great religious movements of the time, and certainly would have posed some of the most difficult competition for Christianity.
Most people who study the origins of Christianity are curious about how this unlikely movement would have succeeded in such a powerful and dramatic way. And it's not an easy question to answer why this movement succeeded when others did not. If you think about the gods of the ancient world and you think about what they look like the emperor and his court. But this religion is saying that every person, man, woman, child, slave, barbarian, no matter who, is made in the image of God and is therefore of enormous value in the eyes of God. Now, in a society that's three-quarters slave, that's an extraordinary message.
But the message of Christianity was by no means uniform. In Egypt, an astonishing discovery made in 1945 shed light on the enormous diversity of early Christian thought.
Other than the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most important archaeological find for much of the early Christian period is the manuscript discovery at Nag Hammadi on the Nile River in Egypt. There, in 1945, was discovered a cache of manuscripts in clay jars buried in the hillside beside the river.
The discovery at Nag Hammadi began with an Arab villager whose name was Muhammad Ali going with his brothers on an ordinary errand. They took their camels and rode up to a cliff, which is honeycombed with thousands of caves. They were digging under the cliffs for fertilizer, that is, for bird droppings, which fertilize the crops. And Muhammad Ali said he struck something when he was digging underground. And curious, he kept digging, and he was startled to find a 6-foot jar, sealed, and next to it was buried a corpse. Muhammad Ali said he hesitated to break the jar because he thought there might be a jinn in it. But hope overcame fear. He said he picked up his mattock and smashed the jar and saw particles of gold fly out of it, much to his delight. But a moment later, he realized it was only fragments of papyrus. Inside the jar were 13 volumes bound in tooled gazelle leather.
What Muhammad Ali had discovered were books written in the ancient Egyptian language known as Coptic. Unable to read them, Ali took them home.
Later, his mother said that she took some of them and threw them into the fire for kindling when she was baking bread. What he didn't know what we didn't know until much later is that these contain some of the most precious texts of the 20th century, that they have uncovered for us a whole new way of seeing the early Christian world.
What the book showed was that early Christianity was even more diverse than scholars had suspected, with many different ways of interpreting Jesus.
There were 52 texts altogether, apparently, unless some of them were burned that we don't know about. And they contain secret gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip. They also contain conversations between Jesus and his disciples that claim to go back to Jesus and his disciples. All kinds of literature from the early Christian era. A whole discovery of texts rather like the New Testament, but also very different.
Christianity, or one would rather say Christianities of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, were again a highly variegated phenomenon. We really can't imagine Christianity as a unified, coherent religious movement.
We probably ought to think of it as a kind of regional diversity. That is, the Christianity at Rome was different than Christianity in North Africa in certain ways, and that was different from what we find in Egypt, and that different from what we find in Syria or back in Palestine.
Some of the oldest Christian communities were in western Turkey, where Paul and his followers had established many of the earliest congregations. At the end of the 1st century, Christians here found themselves in a confrontation with Roman power and authority.
About the year 112, an important event takes place that brings us on the stage in a new way in the history of earliest Christianity. The scene is in the Roman province of Bithynia in modern-day Turkey. At that time, there is a relatively new governor sent to take over. His name is Pliny the Younger.
Pliny was a friend of the Emperor Trajan and was an extremely respected Roman official.
One of Pliny's duties was to maintain order. In this capacity, he was presented with a legal and ethical problem, which he described in a letter to the Emperor Trajan.
Having never been present at any trials of the Christians, I am unacquainted with the methods or limits to be observed either in examining or punishing them.
So we have to imagine Pliny seated in the form of a Roman administrator, a Roman magistrate, all decked out in his finery, enthroned in the tribunal, with his guards and his bailiffs and his courtiers around him. And before him stand these Christians. And Pliny can't figure out who they are or why they're there. Apparently, they've done something that get their neighbors mad at them. The neighbors have complained that the temples are empty and no one's buying certain things for the gods, and they're Christians. And so somehow or another, Pliny is forced to deal with this as a criminal matter.
Pliny genuinely was perplexed because he sees what appear to be good law-abiding citizens being hauled up on trumped-up charges of being a Christian, and simply on that basis, by convention, being subject to capital punishment. So I think Pliny allows us a rare glimpse into the moral and legal conundrum that Christianity posed for morally scrupulous Roman officials.
The method I have observed is this. I interrogated whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question twice again, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be executed.
He says they don't really do all that much. They meet before daybreak. They sing hymns antiphonally. And they worship Christ as if he were a god. And then he says they take an oath, but not an oath to do anything bad, rather an oath only to be good, not to defraud people, not to do anything evil, and so on.
Those who denied they were or had ever been Christians, who repeated after me an invocation to the gods and offered adoration to your image, these I thought it proper to discharge.
And he says to the emperor, do you think I handled it correctly? The emperor then writes back and says, sounds okay to me, but don't go out looking for these Christians, and if you get some anonymous charges against people, don't take that too seriously. We don't want to set any bad precedents here.
Before Pliny, legal precedent still held that Christians were a sect of Judaism.
Because it was considered a part of Judaism, Christianity was considered to be protected by the legal status of Jewish tradition within the Roman Empire. So when we see Pliny taking note of Christians as a separate group, it really marks a departure, a change in the status of Christianity, both in its relationship to Judaism and in its relationship to the Roman Empire.
Pliny's program evolved into a very explicit policy of execution that probably was the model throughout a good deal of Asia Minor, what's now modern Turkey. And that policy was to ask the question, if the answer is no, fine, go sacrifice. If they couldn't sacrifice, then that was proof that they were Christian and they could be executed. So Pliny thought ultimately that once the matter was settled, that he was doing the right thing, that he was saving the empire from the spread of a dangerous and seditious movement.
It was precisely their unwillingness to make public sacrifice to the emperor and the gods that made Christians seem antisocial and seditious.
Religion was one of the most important features of the maintenance of the state. One offered sacrifices on certain days as a part of the celebration of the founding of the state. One offered sacrifices on the birthday of the emperor. Cities very often mounted these enormous celebrations to celebrate the emperors, and all the populace would have been expected to come and join in.
At these great public ceremonials, Christians were becoming all too often conspicuous by their absence.
When the Christians really do become much more prominent in the social arena of Greek and Roman cities, the pagans start to take note of their absence from important festival days and their unwillingness to participate in certain aspects of social life.
Judaism had long ago come to a legal agreement with the emperor that Jews would not be forced to participate in pagan rituals. And pagan rituals are part of the normal fabric of life in a Roman city. Jews were exempted from this because Romans knew that Jews were odd about this kind of thing.
Now along come this new group, the Christians, and they're behaving the same way, but they obviously aren't ancient. They started under Pontius Pilate, they say so themselves. So it's novel. But if it's novel from the Roman point of view, it cannot be a religion. Religion is by definition ancient from the Roman perspective. So if it's new and novel, it's a superstition. It's not a religion. And superstition is by definition not a good thing.
We have a good example of the pagan perspective on Christians from a little graffiti found in Rome from the Palatine Hill. An inscription scratched very crudely into the wall says, Alexamenos worships his God. In the picture we see Alexamenos bowing down before the man on the cross. But the man on the cross has the head of a donkey.
Christians have made themselves outlanders in their own town, and therefore they are used as an explanatory device whenever there are the usual natural insults of human existence. Plague, earthquake, flood. It's because Christians, as Gentiles who are not doing their duty to heaven, are, why should the gods do anything for the city then?
Though persecution was still mainly local and sporadic, it was becoming a crime to be a Christian. Christians who were charged faced a terrible choice: to recant and make a sacrifice to the emperor, or sacrifice their own lives for the faith.
In the blood of the martyrs lie the seeds of the church.
One of the most amazing documents historians of early Christianity are privileged to have is the prison diary of a young woman who was martyred, I think in the year 202 or 203 in Carthage as part of a civic celebration. Her name is Perpetua, and she insisted on being killed.
We were lodged in the prison, and I was terrified, as I had never been in such a dark hole.
Perpetua has brought herself to the attention of the governor, and she is really insisting on being put into the arena. There's an incredibly powerful trial scene where Perpetua's father is pleading with her and finally actually trying to beat her, and the governor has him subdued by his soldiers. And the governor says, please, won't you cooperate? And Perpetua says, no, I'm a Christian. Now, there's no dragnet out for Christians. Perpetua is visited by other Christians in prison. If the governor were trying to get all the Christians in Carthage, he just could have arrested whoever is going to visit Perpetua, but he doesn't.
She's pregnant during part of this story and only gives birth just before she herself goes to her death. She has to give her own child away at the moment that she is about to give her life away.
In my dream, I saw a ladder of tremendous height, made of bronze reaching all the way to the heavens. At the foot of the ladder lay a dragon of enormous size, and it would attack those who would try to climb up. "He will not harm me," I said, "in the name of Jesus Christ."
The authentic diary ends before Perpetua is led into the arena. What we have concluding the diary is a description done by somebody who is presenting a hero tale.
The day of their victory dawned, and they marched from the prison to the amphitheater joyfully, as if they were going to heaven.
She's led out into the amphitheater before the crowds and about to be set upon by beasts. She really goes with a great deal of authority and stature and serenity.
She faces down the animals. And finally, after being tormented by several animals, a young gladiator is sent into the arena to dispatch her. And it's just an incredibly moving scene. His hand is trembling so much he can't cut her. And she grabs his hand and guides his sword to her own throat.
The stories of the martyrs that have come down to us are all hero stories, and they're all intended, obviously, as ways of strengthening the faith of those who remain. If we read only those martyr stories, we would suppose that all Christians were heroes and that the church flourishes because of that heroism. Obviously, this is an idealization. We actually tote up the number of martyrs that we can identify. It's a really quite small number over the 3 centuries during which Christianity was in the position of being the outsiders.
We don't have tens of thousands of people being martyred. What we do have is tens of thousands of people admiring the few who are martyred.
The story of the martyrdom of Perpetua is a very important milestone in the development of early Christianity because of what the story tells us about the perception of Christians at that time. We can see the contrast rather sharply. At the time of Pliny, at the beginning of the 2nd century, Christians are an unknown commodity. And so even when he executes them, he really doesn't know quite what to make of them. Within 100 years, by the year 203, when Perpetua meets her death as a martyr, Christianity has become a recognizable commodity. The death of Perpetua is a story of a very significant change in the status of Christianity. It had begun to be a part of the Roman world.
Now that Christianity has emerged as a group, as a church, as something not Judaism, the question that Christians now confronted is, what is Christianity? The 2nd century is an age of Christian self-definition, in which the Christian church itself was trying to figure out exactly what is the new message, what exactly is the new church.
Certainly there were some religious organizations, such as the ecclesia, the church, the leadership, the bishop, the deacons, the presbyters. There were institutions developing in some Christian churches, but only in some, and this was not universal by any means.
We have, in effect, different brands of Christianity living often side by side, even in the same city. At one point in Rome, Justin Martyr has his Christian school in one part of the city, and the Gnostic teacher Valentinus in another school in Rome, and another so-called heretic by the name of Marcion is also in Rome just down the street somewhere. All of these alongside of the official papal tradition that developed as part of St. Peter's See in Rome. This is where we start to see a kind of proliferation of Gospels tradition all over the empire. And by the 3rd and early 4th century, there are more Gospels than you can actually count, and certainly more than you can easily read within a Bible.
The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for example, shows us a Christian community in which Mary Magdalene is regarded as a disciple, as a leader, as one of the major teachers in the group, and one who claims that women should be able to teach.
Another text called the Gospel of Truth is not a narrative of the death and resurrection of Jesus at all. It's a symbolic reflection on certain themes that come from Scripture and are associated with the life and teachings of Jesus.
One of the important discoveries at Nag Hammadi was a complete copy of the Gospel of Thomas. Written in Syria in the 2nd century, this collection of sayings proved very influential and startling.
The Gospel of Thomas is nothing but sayings of Jesus. It simply goes along and says, Jesus said this, Jesus said that. Well, some of these things that Jesus said, according to the Gospel of Thomas, are quite familiar. They're very similar to things in the canonical Gospels, but not identical.
Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Give to God what belongs to God. And give to me what is mine.
These sayings of Jesus are filled with familiar rustic images, like the parable of the mustard seed. But others are strange and unsettling.
Look to the living one as long as you live, for you might die. And then try to see the living one, and you will be unable to see.
My favorite of these is saying number 70, which says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you.
Now, what is typical about these sayings is that in each instance, these sayings want to say that if you want to understand Jesus, what Jesus said, you have to recognize yourself. You have to know yourself.
With its emphasis on self-knowledge and Jesus as the revealer of secret wisdom, some scholars think that the Gospel of Thomas became a source for a competing stream of Christian tradition known as Gnosticism.
Paul and Pauline Christianity would have placed all of the emphasis on Jesus' death and resurrection and the saving power of that death and resurrection. Gnostic Christianity, on the other hand, would have placed its principal emphasis, in fact, its prime emphasis, on the message, the wisdom, the knowledge that Jesus transmits.
Most Gnostics believed that Jesus was so divine that he had never entered into human form, and so could not have been crucified. This brought Gnostics into conflict with other Christians.
It's very important to insist on Jesus as really suffering and dying on the cross, because Christians were being called upon at that time to suffer and die as witnesses, as martyrs to their faith. And if with some Gnostics you could denigrate the physical suffering of Jesus, you might call into question that obligation to stand and bear witness for the faith.
Bishop Irenaeus, who wrote in the 2nd century in what is now France, was about 18 to 20 years old when his little community was absolutely decimated by a devastating persecution. They say that 50 to 70 people in 2 small towns were tortured and executed. 50 to 70 people executed in public is a devastating destruction of that beleaguered community. And Irenaeus was trying to unify those who were left. What frustrated him is that they didn't all believe the same thing. They didn't all gather under one kind of leadership. And he, like others, was deeply aware of the dangers of fragmentation.
Irenaeus thundered against those he saw as heretics, including the so-called Gnostics.
Let those persons who blaspheme the Creator, as do all the falsely so-called Gnostics, be recognized as agents of Satan by all who worship God.
Bishop Irenaeus coined the term we call orthodox. Now, literally in Greek, orthodox means straight thinking. It's like orthodontia means straight teeth. I mean, orthodox means straight ideas. And those who didn't agree with his ideas, he called heterodox. That means simply thinking otherwise. Or heretics, which means people who make choices about what to think. Irenaeus didn't want people making choices. He wanted them thinking what the bishop told them to think.
Irenaeus had to contend not only with those who believed in vastly different gospels, but also with the followers of Marcion, who believed that Jesus should be represented by just one gospel. He looked for a compromise.
Irenaeus says that the number of the Gospels is properly 4. These are the earliest, these are the best, but 4 is the right number, after all. There's 4 corners to the world, there's 4 winds, there are 4 areas of heaven, and there are 4 beasts who reveal God's will in the apocalypse. 4 is the right number. These are the 4.
The story implied is that there's some smoke-filled room somewhere in the 2nd century, and a bunch of these cigar-smoking Christian big shots got together and they decided who was going in and who was going out. It was a wrap, they closed up, and then everything else was on the cutting room floor, and the janitors took away what didn't get in the canon. I think precisely the contrary is closer to a more responsible historical reconstruction, and that is that there's some kind of consensus among people in the Jesus movement as to what constitutes reliable tradition, reliable literature, literature that they want to read, that they want to hear over and over again, and other kinds of literature that they don't want to hear.
One criterion for inclusion was whether the gospel told the story of the suffering and death of Jesus. This was crucial to the emerging sense of orthodoxy, because the centerpiece of Christian ritual, the celebration of the Eucharist, cannot live without that story.
And it is out of that movement that the 4-gospel canon arrives. And it comes, interestingly enough, as a canon that preserves diversity within limits, but it preserves diversity. There is no claim that this canon represents 4 gospels that are all saying the same thing. It is rather an attempt to bring together as many Christian communities into one major church.
By the middle of the 3rd century, Christians were buried alongside Jews and pagans in catacombs, underground tombs beneath the outskirts of Rome. There is evidence here of the growing homogenization of the Christian story. The artwork on the tombs shows little sign of Gnostic imagery. They are largely scenes from the canonical Gospels, which are now merging into one single story. The art of the catacombs also illustrates the Christians' attempts to integrate into Greco-Roman society.
As Christianity moved out of the Jewish sphere into the more pagan sphere, then all sorts of pagan ideas and all sorts of pagan themes and images and pictures start pouring into Christianity.
We have this figure of the shepherd with the sheep draped over his shoulders. We now may tend to think of that as reflecting the gospel stories of Jesus, of the lost sheep, or Jesus as the good shepherd from the Gospel of John. In point of fact, from Roman perspective, this is the virtue of philanthropy, of love of humanity, and it's one of the most important virtues of Roman civic and public life.
All around the Mediterranean world, the ancient pagan gods lingered in their age-old temples and immemorial shrines. But their power was under threat.
Roman society, Roman law, are both highly tolerant of religious diversity, as long as you do the things which every Roman is expected to do, sort of those religious acts which are your civic duty. Nobody cares what you believe in your heart of hearts. Then appears Christianity, which is exclusive, which is intolerant, which will not allow you to do whatever everybody else does. And it's a profound shock to those who get to know it well. It appears as a dangerous rival to the present society as it begins to grow strong.
The ideas that had started with the carpenter's son were being reinterpreted. In the uncompromising language of Apocalypse, Jesus had preached the message of the coming kingdom of God. Now, Jesus himself became the message and the source of eternal life.
The message that was preached here promised spiritual gifts to people that went beyond the everyday life experience, and promised also immortality, promised a future life, which would be liberation from sickness and from disease and from poverty and individual isolation and whatever. There is a future for the individual. But one should not see the success of Christianity simply on the level of a great religious message.
To the subjects of the Roman Empire, Christianity offered the individual dignity in this life and hope in the afterlife. But it was also winning converts by offering a helping hand to the needy.
For example, like other elements of the Jewish community, the followers of Jesus tended to feed the destitute, take care of people who were widowed so that they wouldn't become prostitutes and orphans and so forth. That was a primary obligation of Jewish piety, and Jesus' followers certainly understood that.
Of course, there was no welfare system, so to speak, in the ancient world. Wealthy Romans had given money for programs such as the feeding of children and so on. But even such programs that we know of didn't compare in size and scope to what the churches were doing.
So Christianity really established a realm of mutual social support for the members who joined the church. And I think that this was probably, in the long run, an enormously important factor for the success of the Christian mission.
By the year 250, Christianity had grown so much that a stronger church organization was needed to administer the welfare system. It was becoming a state within a state. Meanwhile, Rome's rulers felt their control of the empire slipping away, and Christian undermining of traditional belief was no longer to be tolerated.
The middle of the 3rd century is often identified as a crisis in the Roman Empire. This is a time when the emperor is feeling under great pressure. There is a sense that we are being besieged on the borders, that the barbarians may be coming in at any moment, the Persians are dangerous, the Germans are dangerous, and so on. And so there's a great sense that anything that upsets this ancient contract between the Romans and the gods has got to be dangerous to us. After a long period in which the persecutions of Christianity were really spasmodic, local, involved very few people, suddenly in the middle of the 3rd century, the year 250, the Emperor Decius decides that Christians are a real enemy of the Roman order, that they must be dealt with. They must be dealt with empire-wide, with all the police power that the emperor can bring to bear upon them.
Christians could be arrested simply because they bore the name Christianos, Christian. That was enough under Roman convention to convict one of a capital crime, and the crime was being a Christian. So put yourself in the position of society. If you were say a merchant and wanted to limit your competition, all you had to do was point fingers at your competitors and say, well, I think they're Christians. Well, by Roman convention, those people then could be hauled down on capital charges.
What you have to do is get a ticket, a libellus. It's a chit saying that you have sacrificed for the well-being of the empire. And you go and you do your sacrifice, and there's a whole various response on the part of different Christian communities. You can have your servant go and do it for you. He might also be a Christian, but that's his problem. Pay him, he'll get 2 chits, and then you are covered for purposes. Or you can pay for the ticket but not actually do the sacrifice if you can bribe a friend of yours who's a magistrate. Or you can just go ahead and get, sacrifice knowing that these gods are nothing. After all, that's right in Paul's letters, that these gods are nothing.
As to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that no idol in the world really exists, and that there is no God but one.
Decius was determined to be completely ruthless in persecuting those who refused to make public sacrifice. For the first time, ordinary Christians were methodically rounded up.
And the odd thing is it fails. The net effect of this is that a new cult of the martyrs appears in Christianity, which strengthens the church.
50 years later, the Emperor Diocletian made one last attempt to wipe out the Christians. He targeted those who held public office, but the persecution failed partly because Christian institutions were now so entrenched in Roman society.
Christians wanted to have their members knowledgeable and capable of reading the Bible. So we find that a large number of people in imperial administration are Christians because they could read and write, which constituted a big problem is the persecution of the Christians, because they were thrown out of their office first when the persecution began, and suddenly the government didn't work anymore.
By that time, the Christians are so numerous that they can't possibly be eradicated. They've already grown that much. So in a sense, the persecution really doesn't catch up until it's already too late.
By now, the Jesus movement had spread its message to every corner of the Roman Empire.
The last decades of the 3rd century, you get a great insurge of people into Christianity. There's some scholars who think that in Egypt, for example, by the 320s, there would actually be a majority of Christians, maybe a rather slight majority, but nonetheless a sizable number of Christians.
The turning point in the history of the Christian movement occurred in the first decades of the 4th century. It was a transformation filled with ironies. It was brought about by a Roman general who worshipped not Jesus, but Apollo, the god of the sun.
One of the most surprising Christian heroes in the entire tradition, I think, is Constantine. He is, first of all, a successful general. He is also the son of a successful general and at the head of the army of the West, and he's fighting another successful general, struggling for who is going to be at the top of the heap of the very higher echelons of Roman government. What happens is that Constantine has a vision.
In the dream, a cross appears on the sun. The sun was very important to Constantine anyway. He had a thing about Helios and very often represented himself with a sun god. But the intrusion of the cross was something new. And below this vision was an inscription, were the words, "By this conquer, in tuto Nike." And he interpreted this dream to mean that by this symbol of the cross, he could defeat his archenemy at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and become sole emperor. And so he had so the story goes, he had his soldiers paint the cross on their shields. Constantine won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, and then, in a dramatic shift of geopolitics, relocates the center of Roman rule from the eternal city Rome to a new city, Constantinople.
To reunite a divided empire, Constantine moved the capital from Rome to a more strategic location, the ancient city of Byzantium, and renamed it Constantinople.
When Constantine came into power and started to favor Christianity, he did do many things that plainly showed his support for Christianity. He gave money for the building of churches, money for the copying of scriptures. He exempted clergy members from having to perform civic duties on town councils, that kind of thing.
The bishops are able to take advantage of Constantine's mood and his curious intellectual interest in things like Christology and the Trinity and church organization. They're able to have Bibles copied at public expense. They're finally able to have public Christian architecture and big basilicas. So there's a comfortable symbiotic relationship between the empire and the church.
All that certainly stands in favor of his true Christian commitment. On the other hand, he did retain the coinage with the sun god on it. He did say the day of the sun would be made a day of rest, but it's very unclear whether the day of the sun meant the day dedicated to the sun god or the day dedicated to Jesus and his resurrection.
Whatever one finally decides about the nature of his conversion, whether it's a real, sincere conversion or not, it has profound impact upon the future of Christianity, upon the future of Western civilization. Constantine's patronage doesn't just mean that a lot of new churches get built, though it means that. It doesn't just mean that the salaries of bishops go up astronomically, though it means that. It doesn't just mean that Christians have freedom now to worship as they choose. It means that it has become part of the imperial establishment. And obviously that is going to mean profound changes for the society and for Christianity.
Constantine showed his support by massive building programs, especially in Jerusalem. Ironically, the city that was destroyed by one Roman emperor was being rebuilt by another. But the new holy places in this traditional center of Judaism were now all Christian. To strengthen his new church, Constantine called for more unity in organization and teaching. But such unity came at a cost.
One of the first things Constantine does as emperor is start persecuting other Christians. The Gnostic Christians are targeted. Marcionite Christians and other dualist Christians, Christians who don't have the Old Testament as part of their canon, are targeted. The list of enemies goes on and on. There's a kind of, in a sense, internal purge of the church as one emperor ruling one empire tries to have a single church.
To appreciate the remarkable, dramatic evolution that had occurred in so short a period, one might counterpose the image of Pliny in his courtroom under the Emperor Trajan, sending Christians off to their execution simply for being called Christians, to the majesty of Constantine presiding over the great gathering of bishops that he had called to resolve particular questions. The imperium on the one hand being used clearly to extinguish a religious movement, the imperium on the other hand being used clearly to undergird and support a religious movement, the same religious movement in so short a period of time.
The cross, the hated symbol of death and defeat, now emerged as the symbol of triumph. And in the eyes of some, the apocalyptic prophecy of Revelation had at last been fulfilled.
The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ.
The kingdom of God and the Roman Empire had now become one and the same. Jesus of Nazareth had become Jesus Christ. And his church had become a power on earth. A new chapter in history was about to begin.